So I was just talking about sort of anti-fragility. And so one of the key elements of our thesis that was titled Antifragility was fundamentally that Africa is really sort of a constellation of very large, iceberg-like, informal, fragmented, and very volatile markets. And what was interesting to us as an insight was that the disorder that people saw from the outside looking in was really a fundamental underpinning for how you could create value, in anti-fragile companies. And this is not true in a lot of other markets, but it is true for us in Africa. And so why we decided to do this was to sort of name that as part of what we thought was the fundamental way of how to build these businesses and how to create value and how to exchange value, to the sub-markets that were being sort of addressed with products and services and solutions. And one interesting sort of concept that we thought about, which is it's really fundamental about how you think very intuitively in situations of chaos. A classic example is sort of how sailboats work. And so for some of you who are sailors will probably understand this. We'll share the slides anyway, so we'll talk a little bit more, not too much about it. But the key takeaway that's sort of interesting is that fundamentally, if you're sailing windward, right, the boat cannot work. It doesn't work if you're pointing directly at the wind. It has to be at an angle to the wind. And so the key takeaway from sort of sailing, which is you sort of battling nature, which is kind of interesting, fundamentally sort of how we're dealing with this pandemic now, is that you've got to take away that wind coming in an adverse direction to you is very counterintuitive, enables the boat to travel in the direction of the wind. And so why does that matter to all of us? Well, key takeaways is that your equipment has to be in working order and your hatches have to be battened down. So there cannot be any gaps, there cannot be any holes. You've got to come to the wind with full resilience. But you also have to correctly read the wind and the currents, and you've got to be able to maximize your opportunities when they show up. And you've got to be able to sail into the wind, which is actually sort of counterintuitive to how you would think about it. So what we're trying to do in this webinar today is to tell you, yes, we understand the concerns, we understand the fear. I mean, we're all we don't have answers to everything, but for us to sort of come out on the other side, which is exactly what will happen because that's what has happened in other recessions, there is light at the end of the tunnel. It's just a long tunnel. We don't quite know how long the tunnel is, as we didn't really before, and it's quite global in this case, but you've got to be able to figure out how to sail into the wind. So looking back very quickly, what has happened? I mean, forgive the French, but everything has gone to hell. We have seen such a rapid decline in just the economies of around the world. We in Africa, I think we're very lucky. It has ended up sort of us being the last continent, as we have been for a lot of other scenarios. But what we found is that as we've sort of been dealing with the pandemic around COVID-19, we've had other, what I will call in quotes, pandemics. We've had sort of the disruption that Brexit has created and create sort of, market uncertainty. We've got a year where we're dealing with sort of the US elections, but most importantly for, countries like Nigeria and the like, we've had to deal with the battle, concurrent battle of oil prices, right? And so what we're finding right now is that for a lot of these African countries, they're probably going to be running into a constellation of just negative events. There are issues around oil prices, there are issues around food security, parts of Africa dealing with locusts, and it's, you're dealing with locusts, you're dealing with pandemic, you're dealing with oil prices. It looks like everybody's just getting hammered. And some industries have come to an absolute halt. I think, again, going back to the original concept of how we just did not, we've not seen anything like this. Someone asked me a week or two ago what I think I'd learned throughout this COVID process. And I said, I had a sort of very high level theoretical view of how interconnected we were and how codependent we were. But it has become absolute reality of how codependent we are, even when we're operating in different industries. And why this is important is that we're the only ones that are going to sort of bail ourselves out as entrepreneurs, as investors, as ecosystem participants and supporters. We're the only ones, right? Because what we're learning as well is that once everybody else is busy and inwardly focused, nobody cares about nobody else, right? And so what we found is, you know, and what we're sort of trying to go to talk about today is how to sort of work, understanding that codependency, understanding that interconnectedness, not just within industries, ex-countries, you know, cross-border. We've got to figure out how to sort of work with each other to ensure that we come out of this faster and more resilient than we went going into it. And so we, you know, in the slide, we talk a little bit about sort of the entire, what the industries that have suffered. And it's insane. You know, tourism has come to a halt. All the ad spend around travel, dead. You're looking at airlines that have essentially just gone to 80, 90% of complete lost capacity. You know, sports has come to a halt. The NCAA March Madness will have generated $1 billion in revenues. That's gone. The European Championships, gone. The Olympics, gone. And then all of a sudden you realize that, you know, when there are no sports, there's really no sports betting, right? So that's gone. The events business, of course, has gone to complete it's a shit show. And aviation is also a shit show. So, you know, they're highly affected industries. And what's interesting, I mean, I'll give an example of how a lot of these things sort of we have to sort of dig deep to figure out a way out of this. Aviation, the biggest cost element in aviation is fuel. And so literally during the best time, what would have been the best time for the aviation industry, where the Mexican Pemex basket is $15, and you know, and Nigeria is sort of taking $8, $10 discounts on Bonny Light crude, and the Saudis have an $8 discount on their heavy crude. Aviation is hurting because no one's flying. So you got this best fuel pricing, you know, ever, and nobody's flying, right? So it is an interesting sort of constellation of things, and everyone is getting hit. But here's the thing we've come to tell you. As founders, as investors, post-recession value creation, one of the things that has been consistent, and it will not change, is that great companies and great platforms have been built during the absolute worst times, when everything looks dark. It is absolutely important to remember that. The light will come on. It will be at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes it actually show up before the end of the tunnel. But this has shown up. And, you know, when I started this process, beginning of 2001, just hammered, I was afraid. Everybody was afraid. You would come to work, you never knew if you had a job. You would come to work, you never knew if your customers had filed for bankruptcy. And so you had to sort of figure out how every day you were your best representation of yourself. And this is interesting for founders particularly because, you know, it's one of the loneliest jobs in the world. You always have to sort of be the life of the party, and you always have to sort of be the one driving, you know, strategy and fundraising and the like, and it just feels like nobody else feels your pain. But many people do, they just don't voice it. But what I think it's important for us to recognize is this has always been the case. We will create value, but how do we build resilience for ourselves? And how do we ensure that the interconnectedness that we're all sort of, you know, subject to can sort of be harnessed and consolidated and collated to build sort of the very best companies that we can. So going back to the concept of anti-fragility, fundamentally, we've got to be able to create companies that thrive in a state of disorder. And that's probably what we've been doing for a while. We've not sort of actually figured it out. But part of what's interesting is that, and you know, we've said this a lot, we need to stop looking at the tech crunches of the world and the Western sort of models of how things work, and start to build companies that can address how things are and then you build a future for how you want things to be. But it is fundamentally that. We've used some examples here. Zoom, seeing a surge in demand, unbelievable business. They're scaling so rapidly. But, the founder of Zoom was one of the founding engineers at WebEx. And he got frustrated because things were not working right. He didn't think it was the best product they could bring to the market. And as hot as Zoom is today, they struggle to raise money. Forget the end story. They struggled to raise money. Everybody was like, well, there are competitors in the market and so on and so forth. And I've shared this on Twitter about how one of the key things that I love is a conversation I had with Luke Nosek, one of the GPs that Founders Fund, who's moved on to do his own thing now. And we're having dinner one evening in San Francisco. And he was like, the funny thing about, how people size markets and so on and so forth is that they go about it in sort of the wrong way. Now, Luke and Founders Fund, of course, they're all ex-PayPal boys. And they also they went into the roughness, right? 1999, 2000. But one of the key things that Luke shared with me that was very profound, I've never sort of forgotten it, is that you can create, for one of a better term, a unicorn that can deliver a product or solution that simply sucks less than what's in the market. So not some highfalutin, big vision, I'm going to go to the moon with this thing. Just literally, I've got a product and it's better. It actually works better and creates and removes some of the friction that you have in other products. And that's going to be true, I think, going forward. And that's what I think we want everybody to understand, that the opportunities for us to build products and services for our market, have never been greater, right? And what we're learning now, as we've learned in other markets, is that a dependency on sourcing financing from these markets, works when everything is great. But the minute everything sort of turns around, then you just realize that all these sort of founder-friendly folks and blog posts and everything don't actually mean a thing, because everybody is focused. Like one of the highly positive correlations is in any recession, people literally cannot see further than 5 miles, right? So any company that's sort of outside of the 5-mile radius is just not in the mix. So building anti-fragile companies should be a fundamental thing we do every day, right? And you look at these things, Tinder, anti-fragile, of course, relationships are sort of constant, on-demand courier services, video sharing. These are things that, as the world goes into complete chaos, everybody sort of aggregates into these platforms. And that's going to be key, is understanding that you are going to be good in a great market and you will be outstanding in a bad market. And that's the key thing that we want to talk about today. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how sort of companies should think about anti-fragility, sort of the thing around, your team, really thinking about customer needs versus wants. So that's going to be important. Capital, liquidity, your go-to-market strategy, and how you sort of capture value and make your revenues. So what is going to be important, I think, is sort of being able to read what's coming and being able to plan and react for that, as well as plan for what's going to be. And, what we've seen is we've gone from smaller companies in our market, big companies, sort of going through that whole, we missed plan, we're forecasts and so on and so forth. We've gone from level 1 to level 3, which is a liquidity crisis, severe drops in revenue, and literally the viability of parts of all of your business becoming in question. And what's going to be important as a takeaway, I think, to entrepreneurs is you've got to be able to stress test your P&L and your liquidity. And what do I mean by stress test? You've got to be able to sit down and say, listen, what do I do if I misplan by 10%? I misplan by 30, I misplan by 50, I misplan by 70. So in up markets, everybody thinks everything is up and to the right. But the truth is it's not. And it doesn't have to be a pandemic that sort of shakes you or sort of shows the weakness in your business model. You've got to be able to sort of think about it. And what we saw over the last year or two is that we kept seeing these businesses come across our desks that's sort of, we're dependent on constant infusions of capital. And that doesn't make any sense. Now, maybe we were not as bullish as other investors, and that's great. You know, we can live with that. But the fact of the matter is that if you never optimize your business for unit economics, then you are always going to be completely exposed when anything changed. And when I talk about anything changing, you know, exposure can be everything. It could be a failed product. It could be a loss of customers. It could be government regulatory regime changing. It could be, you know, the way competition works in Africa, which is, you know, they don't play fair, and you just get caught. And so a lot of that is the key takeaway here, I think, from us is you have got to create some sort of format or framework that says, listen, every quarter, let's stress test this thing. What are we missing? Where are we missing? You know, which customers are we excessively exposed to? Which ones are we not interested in? Where can we find new customers? How can we diversify our risk? This is so important. It needs to become part of your behavior, because what we're trying to figure out here is how do you make anti-fragility in your entire sort of model and business and team, how do you make it as natural as breathing? And how do you make it as regular as breathing? So that's going to be, I think, an important takeaway. The other thing is cash. Everybody, you know, you sort of hear this whole thing about cash being king, but it's not just cash that's king. Cash management efficiency is also king. So you've got sort of this very interesting dual crown model. And everything sort of ties into what I'll call sort of the 3 points of a triangle, which would be your operating expenses, your sales, and your liquidity. And I know this hurts, because when you spend years of your life sort of trying to build something that you know, you're mission driven to build and deploy and enable, you know, customer segments, it is going to be important at this time, and this is what we've shared with our portfolio companies, to make the hard decisions. And the faster you make the hard decisions, the better it is for everybody. Now, I'm not throwing this out there because, you know, I'm going to write a blog post that sort of talks about hand waving. I've been through this a few times, and it is the worst thing. You know, when I was chief of staff for Intel Capital, we ran a reduction in force as an outcome of sort of bloated operating expenses and declining sales, you know, to take 20–30% of the employee force. And it's the thing I've hated the most in my entire professional career. And it makes me physically ill. And part of this is a lot of you are going to have to do that. And so it's very important to sort of anticipate what is going to make you feel. You should feel it. It's very important. It reminds me of the Chinese phrase, you have to teach yourself how to eat bitterness. That's going to be important. You have to understand what your levers are and make the necessary changes. So one of the key things will be reduce unnecessary overhead. This is very important. You need to look at every element of your headcount and ask yourself, if this person leaves, does the business disappear? If the business does not disappear, you've got to be able to have that tough conversation about that. I know people feel, you know, okay, this person has done X and Y, but they would understand because they would do the same thing. You know, because at the end of the day, it is a zero-sum game. You either take those hard steps or the business dies. And then everybody's out of a job. See, what you want to be able to figure out is how to stay alive. Because if you stay alive, then you give yourself another shot at possibly rehiring these people when things change. But it's very important to take care of that. So your unit headcount, very important. Non-core business spending, very important. And this is kind of a key thing, and this ties into sort of the sales part of it. You've got to be able to have honest conversations with your customers. Everybody in this case now, what's interesting, I think, is every sector is hammered. So there is nobody that's not in a position of weakness, right? So you going to a customer and saying, listen, I'm struggling with this thing, this and that, they're going to understand because they have some facet of their business that is also dealing with weakness. And so this is the time when you've got to sort of be able to take advantage and say, listen, we need to go figure this stuff out because it's not working. And this is true for those of you who don't know how to have difficult conversations. Reach out to your board advisors, your directors, your investors. If that's not something you want to be able to do on your own, they can come in and support you on this. But you're going to have a lot of difficult conversations, and it's very important to understand that you get equipped with the tools to go in and do those conversations. On the sales side, that's fundamentally about keeping yourself alive longer. It's essentially like your ventilator, right? If you sort of collapse and your breathing gets, you're sort of in the week 3 of COVID, you've got to have a ventilator, and that's exactly how you extend your runway to keep your body running and your antibodies having enough time to kick in. So you've got to be able to, while you're sort of very inwardly focused in trying to manage your operating expenses, you've also got to understand what's happening in the market, what's changing, what conditions are existing today that didn't exist 3 months ago, right? And here's what the weird thing is, which is something we've seen as well, that you might actually be able to create a new product that you will have the ability to sort of, increase your price, because you might just literally find a demand vein that you didn't see before because you were just sort of, you just didn't have the focus. And so what's going to be important is understanding what's happening in the market, continuing to maintain that high resolution insights into new conditions, but at the same time, treating your existing customers well. And that's going to be important. Everybody's hammered, everybody's scared, but people always remember what, that classic saying, people may sort of ignore, a lot of things, but they never forget the way you treated them. And so what is going to be important is how you treat them, right? They understand that, listen, you've got to be able to cut back on their services. You've got to do this, you got to do that. That's going to be important. But retention is going to be key in the post-COVID world. And you've got to make sure, not customer acquisition, customer retention. You've got to make sure that you're on there. And then the most important part is liquidity, because it keeps you alive. And so, if there's any stuff that you can do with government agencies, this AP, accounts payable, accounts receivable, very important. People, if you were in a market where people were used to paying your invoices 90 days, you got to go to them and say you can't do that anymore. You've got people, you just can't. And so the outcome is either your business shuts down or people sort of start to treat you a little bit more fairly. And it's going to be important that you stress test the worst case scenarios. The worst case scenario is your business shuts down. So that's going to be important. Stress test that, under what circumstances will that happen, and make sure that you can avoid getting to that outcome as quickly as possible. And then, I think finally, the new practices, some of you probably have these practices in place. And, particularly for startups, you're just hauling from one firefight to another. And so very few founders have enough time and what I would call essentially sort of capacity to sort of think, longer term, right, strategically. But this is the time to do that, right? This is literally the time to do that, because you're getting hammered, but you've got to be able to pause and think strategically. Bring your team together and just say, you know what, the world is burning, that's great, but what do we need to sort of pause and think about what our business is going to be and evolve it? So there's some measures, we'll talk about it with our panelists as well. There's some general measures, it's going to be important to have a COVID task force. People talk about that, but that, it's crazy, right? So you're watching, for instance, in Nigeria, you look at sort of Nigeria 2 weeks ago, Nigeria today, and you're just incredibly sort of amazed by how quickly things seem to be declining. you've got to have that because you need to know what this thing is doing to your business. This contingency plan is very important. Business continuity, that's going to be an important thing. Double, triple, quadruple check key supply contracts, customers, checking with the customers, checking with the suppliers, not sending emails, call them. You've got to know what's going on. You need to track government policies. One of the things, we obviously encourage folks is banding together to sort of, communicate with government agencies about the specific needs of the sector. We're trying to drive something like that. So that's sort of, and that's sort of on the general measures side. On the business preparation side, your customers' targets, your revenue forecasts, you've got to sort of know what's going on. We talked a little bit about customer loyalty, but this is kind of important. Customer needs are going to be changing. I mean, some of the, talking to entrepreneurs, and investors, some of the questions that have come up have been around things like, so what does the post-COVID world look like? What do opportunities in that world look like? And so everybody's sort of talking about the same things. Well, remote work is going to be important. Education, EdTech is going to be important. Healthcare, everybody's something like, oh, healthcare is the thing. But that's not a customer need. That's us projecting what we think they're going to need. What we need to do is to focus on what they're indicating they need, right? So, people are saying, oh, we're going to sort of go build sort of remote diagnostics and whatever it is, and that's great. But if there's no demand for that, it sounds great now in sort of in the current context of the world we're in. But, sometimes the basic need is, as we've said, why don't pharmacies, that tend to sort of do most of the, the descriptors around, recommending drugs and the like, how do you improve the decision-making at the point of sale? How do you improve the decision-making? So that has nothing to do with COVID. That was a need before, and it's an increasing need now. And that's going to be important, sort of hone in on that. And, one thing, again, is looking at the product. I talked a little bit about that earlier. And again, it zooms in back to the customer. Like, what are the needs of the customers right now? What are their fears? What are their demands? And fundamentally, because what has happened now is we've dealt with both a supply shock and a demand shock. So there's a real possibility that a lot of people are not going to have money in any sort of meaningful way to buy anything expensive. And, and what I love about our Africa submarkets is that we, for the most part, we're very resilient, right? I mean, we just, life is just full of friction to begin with. And so one more point of friction doesn't sort of really throw us off as much. Of course, if you're dead, that's a different story from COVID, but it doesn't throw us off as much. And, but what is going to be is that, sort of the share of the pocket has gotten smaller. And, and any economic shutdowns, as we've seen in South Africa and Kenya, just means that this pocket has become minute. And so it's going to be important to sort of be empathetic to that, when you're sort of delivering products or services that they can use. And then I think finally on business prep, and this is something I talk about, sort of the interconnectedness. Yes, the companies that are, competing, for different sectors. But the truth of the matter is this: there is no sector we've seen where 10 companies cannot be built that do $100 million in revenues in Africa. There is no sector. So here's the thing: why is everybody spending so much time competing, particularly in a situation like now, versus collaborating, consolidating, and working together? And maybe that's your best shot. Maybe your shot is not, you sit down and say, listen, you know what, maybe I just need to go, build this company as part of another one. And that's going to be very important. It's not that you necessarily acquire, but maybe you get acquired, right? But you consolidate that. We're encouraging companies to do that, folks that come to us, because we see a lot of these interesting businesses and say, listen, you're better off working together than you're not. Now, in some cases, cultural fits won't make it happen. But in many cases, I think, if you have smart, founders that are sort of, they understand sort of, they've got conviction about what they're doing, but they also understand how to be pragmatic. I think we can sort of, again, create even more anti-fragile companies by consolidating, a bunch of these ones. And the basic housekeeping, encouraging employees to work from home, moving meetings to video conferences. And here's the thing: we we understand that. I mean, I think for us as a firm, one thing we did was that we recognized that working from home has, just different types of dependencies that are not obvious to people in the sort of emerged world. It's a very different cost structure for many employees when they don't have the Wi-Fi that the office provides, they don't have the power that the office provides. And then, you have a bunch of folks who live in estates and, the estates are like, oh yeah, we have the generator on from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. So, what are you working from home, right? And, and then they start hitting you with sort of these, fees and the like, and it's just incredible. So one thing we did was we offered to portfolio companies that for the key staff, we would, as a firm, we'll pay out of our pockets to support, data plans and 4 hours of fuel every day, every workday. It's a small thing, we don't have a large portfolio, thankfully. But it was sort of recognizing the understanding. And for the investors on the call, this is the stuff that, is important to sort of talk to your founders. You take something off the table that is not stressing them out. It communicates to the portfolio companies, employees that you understand what the real issue is and you're trying to help a lot of them out. And that's going to be very important to sort of remove the friction from this work from home, required work from home construct. The other key thing is communication. I can't emphasize this enough. You must be transparent. You must communicate. What is the business going through? Don't make, sort of hurried decisions and then lose track of sort of where you are. Communicate with your investors, communicate with your board, figure out ideas about how to stay alive. Because here's the truth of the matter. For many of you, the products and services and solutions you provide, absolutely key to people, the key to customers. And their lives are better because you exist. So you can't just quit because you're like, oh my God, the business has sort of gone to hell. No, everybody's gone through this. Forget all the theory and the talk and the PR stuff you see outside. The companies you see that are making a lot of noise, and I know they're struggling, right, in the US. And so it's going to be important to be transparent now. And this is, I think, is going to be an important element of culture that you can sort of build now, is how you communicate with your employees, how you communicate with your investors. Don't put your head down in the sand. Don't do any ostriching. That doesn't work. You've got to be able to just make sure that you are telling people the truth and that they always know they can count on you to tell them the truth, because there's no difference. You have to do that. So, and then of course you try to, take as many of the guidelines. We're also doing some other work around trying to figure out how to build things at scale for the markets that we support in Africa, health-wise. But, just tell your employees, be smart. If you don't have surgical masks, get a scarf, just reduce your surface area of infection. This is very important because for a lot of these people, I talked about it, on Twitter, but for a lot of the markets we serve, poverty is a comorbidity, is an underlying condition of why people die. And so what we have to try to do the best we can is to try to protect them. And if it means just, yeah, fine, you don't have a surgical mask, you don't have an N95 mask. Okay, great. What do? Wear long sleeves, try to wash your hands, use sanitizer. Let me teach you how to make sanitizer. Use a scarf around your nose and your face and your mouth. Those are the basic things, right? But just show them that you care and that you understand that we are in difficult times, but their health and their wellness is going to be important to you as well as everybody around it. So what I'm going to do now is that I am going to have our speakers introduce themselves, and fundamentally, I'm just going to leave that a little bit open, but everybody sort of gets 3 to 5 minutes to talk about what they've seen over the years, through the lenses of both direct and indirect experience, and share some ideas and guidance for how to manage, whether or not you're an investor or you're a entrepreneur or you are legal counsel or an accountant, or you're thinking about starting a business. It'd be great to sort of get that. So why don't we go ahead and do that? Not sure how we unmute this, but I'll go on mute. Let's see. So who do we unmute here? Okay, so I'm going to start to, oh, great. Yep, it's happening. It's happening. Awesome. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So, oh, that's an error. We should have actually had Folabi on this slide. So, but why don't we go ahead and get started? Folabi, you're free. Why don't you go ahead and get started and tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you've seen and what kinds of guidance you can offer to people.
Thank you very much, Eghosa, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Folabi Esan, one of the founding partners of Adlevo Capital. And for those of you who might not know, Adlevo Capital is one of the first companies, PE companies that focused on technology-enabled investments on the African continent. We took an approach that said Africa is the last continent where things are going to grow. They're young people, and at the time we started, the telecoms revolution was very, very new. Eghosa, thanks for the very comprehensive lead-in. I have a lot of things that we could talk about, but the first thing that really strikes me is that we started out fundraising properly in January 2008. And so we had a wonderful run of events until about July or August 2008. And then the bottom fell out of the market. For those who don't know, of course, that's when Lehman Brothers happened and the whole world went into a recession, a global financial meltdown, which wiped out lots of value on the markets and essentially stopped us dead in our tracks. Can everyone? So, I mean, for us, that was a baptism by fire. And it took us 2 years to sort of recover, find our feet, and get to maybe like 2/3 of where we were. Very, very hard times, very difficult. Hard to explain how it was, but this feels very much the same. Let me just give you a sense of how it was in 2008. We had soft-circled $67 million of a $100 million target fund. We had hired people. We had paid 2 years rent for an office in Lagos, which you have to do. We had brought these people from the United States and from the UK from their jobs. They've left their jobs. They joined us in Lagos. We sent out our final documentation to the LPs, and then Lehman Brothers hit. The LPs disappeared. There was no money. We had a full staff. We had an office. We had everything, but we had nowhere to go. So literally all dressed up and nowhere to go. Initially, we thought it was going to take us 2 months or 3 months to get out of it. That was our first thought or hope or dream. And so we thought by December, it will be fine. And we kept our staff on full salary. We paid out of our pockets and so on. Come December, we went home for Christmas and came back and realized this is going to take a while. We put everyone on quarter pay and hoped for the best. In the end, we had to let them all take a choice whether they'd stay after 6 months and just use the facilities, which were fully paid, or let them go. Fortunately, they stayed, but it took us another 2 years to then close the fund at 2/3 of where we were in August 2008. So for us, looking at what's going on now between COVID globally and in Nigeria, where most of our investments are, the drop in oil prices and the attendant devaluation of the Naira again, it feels very much like deja vu all over again. So I'll let the other guys speak a little bit, and then we can talk about antifragility and what we've done about that. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Folabi. So Rebecca, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself and yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Enonchong. I'm speaking here as a founder and CEO of AppsTech and IO Spaces, which are two businesses that I started actually in the US. AppsTech I later expanded to other parts of the world. I've been through this twice. This is my third time, because I started my company in 1999, and it was still the dot-com boom and just the beginning of the dot-com bust. And so, because I've been through it, and then of course the 2008, and in the middle of that, lots of challenges. So just to cut it short, really, it's about our resiliency as Africans. I think we'll get us through this, but I'm telling you, be ready for the wildest ride in your life. You know, having gone through 9/11, having gone through, you know, as I said, the dot-com bust, having gone through the crash of 2008, I don't think anything prepares us for this, other than our mental ability to get through it. And I think we can plan all we want. We can put everything on paper. Everything looks great. You know, we have a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, and believe it or not, you end up trying to figure out how to get out of X, Y, and Z. So I think that, you know, the concentration right now is actually very personal. Is if you as an individual can strengthen your psychology, just keep it strong and try to keep it together for your team, for your clients. You know, we lost lots of clients in the early 2000s. Like they just, you know, 50,000 employee companies that just vanished. They were gone. So it's you know, and they were paying $50,000 a month, right? So huge revenue challenges. We had other clients that couldn't pay their bills at all. And you know, what are you going to do? Just you try to continue to serve them for as long as you can. And then you have to keep your employees on because you're trying to, you know, sign new customers. And so it's a rolling thing. And I really think that having been through this many, many times, I think the best way you can possibly prepare is to really prepare yourself, and don't lose it, right? I think if you can just stay sane during these periods, we haven't seen anything yet. This is just, there's nothing. Right now, really, there's nothing. I think that we're seeing in Europe some of the tragedy around this, but we have not seen it in Africa yet. I don't even think the US outside of New York has really seen it yet. But the economic impact will be worldwide. Everybody will feel it in every sector, you know, not just oil, but just because of the oil. Look at Central Africa. All of the economies, their main export is oil. So, I mean, I just can't imagine what things will be like in a year when everybody's cash has run dry, nobody's coming in and investing. You know, I can't imagine what it's going to be like. And I really, you know, just because I've been through this, find all the tools to help you get through this mentally. That's really my best advice, whether it's your faith, whether it's meditation, whether it's, you know, whatever tool, whatever way you can think of to get through this, you need to be strong because you're leaders and people are depending on you. And, you know, so that's really my advice.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. We'll come back to you, of course. Tokunboh, can we hear from you, please?
Yes, hello everybody. Thanks for putting this together, Eghosa. My name is Tokunboh Ishmael, co-founder and managing director of Alitheia Capital. You know, the Rebecca and Folabi have said some of the things I'm going to say, but I'll just sort of give some context to what I'm going to say. So I've been through 3 of these now, with this one included, just as Rebecca said. I was working in Silicon Valley when the market tanked in March 2000. Thankfully, the company I was working with managed to sell itself just before in that same month. And the same again, 2008 and now. So what did I learn from when the March 2000 era with the .com bust, as Rebecca phrased it? What I saw back in the Valley then was everyone sort of going back to basics and focusing. If you're familiar with those times, you'll remember that there were quite a few business models that, you know, if they had really been put under the microscope, really didn't stand the test of time. But because there was an abundance of enthusiasm and probably funding, they got funded. And once the bust came, everyone realized they needed to get back to basics, focus on the customer, focus on what they could do right. Similarly, when we go to 2008, we had, Alitheia had just started in 2007 actually, and we were also on the road and funding dried up. And we decided to take a different approach and focused on what we could do best, which was looking for transactions in the market, and partnered with Goodwell, actually Wim's on the line, to deploy capital that they were able to bring to the table from non-traditional investors at the time. So again, there it was, okay, what can we do well? What can we focus on? But also introducing flexibility to pivot into the best way to come to the market and remain in the market. And so when we come to now with what's going on, I mean, this is, if there's a color blacker than black, this is our blackest swan. I've just been gobsmacked at the global nature of it, right? It's not that there's a cold somewhere in Asia and it's not spreading. This is a cold that happened and is spreading, and everyone's got the flu. I mean, like, I don't know of a time in my lifetime where everyone in every economy is facing the same thing. So again, but I still feel that even with that, again, it's back to basics, cutting the fat and focusing, but also taking opportunity through flexibility, because I think that innovation is going to play a key role in us coming out of this, and not just in the healthcare space. And people are going to see different ways. I think in my comments that I submitted earlier, we're going to see that even the naysayers around technology, even the naysayers that existed in the year 2020, everyone now realizes that it's not this sector, new sector, baby sector on the outskirts there for boot camps, but it's a tool that will pervade every sector. We're all experiencing that. I mean, some of us, our grandfather, they never knew before. But more importantly, some businesses are now realizing that they can actually extend, whether it's in the studios that are taking all their classes online, fitness classes, or whether it's even in the trainers that are now realizing that they should repurpose their content and provide that out to a wider audience. And what I've seen with some of this opportunity is people are reaching broader audiences. I mean, hey, even the churches are saying they have more people than they've ever had tune into their services. So being flexible and leveraging innovation is going to be important at this time, alongside sticking to the basics, going back to basics and a good focus. And, sort of, if I would envelope all of that, it really is about well-being. Some of us on the call probably haven't worked from home before, maybe. And I would just say that even as you work from home, it's very easy in these times to take on even more than you were doing before, because there's that ever-present workspace, right? But you need to really center yourselves and stay well, have a structure, have a routine, and still recognize boundaries. And on the bright side, leverage the opportunity to be closer to your loved ones, but because you're going to need to be stronger for the times ahead. So I'll just leave that for now.
Thank you so much, Tokunboh. I really appreciated that. And we've got Vim on the line. And so Vim, looking forward to hearing from you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, good afternoon, and Eghosa, first of all, thank you for organizing this, a fantastic initiative. I'm also in the fortunate position that I've seen some crises before. Not that it's anything that I've done anything to deserve that, other than just being just my age. I was in the what this one reminds me of is 9/11 actually. I was at the time running a startup that had actually just launched a new model in the institutional asset management industry. And I was at a conference in Paris when 9/11 happened with a lot of people from the securities and institutional asset management industry. And the sense that was described also before by some of the other panelists, the sense of immediate sort of connection and understanding that this is something big and it affects us all, that we had at that moment in that event is what I'm reminded by with what I see happening right now. What strikes me with this, based on earlier crises that we've seen, and of course, as Tokunboh mentioned, also we were on the road in 2008, raising a new fund, and realized we had to do things differently, and so learning from those experiences, three things that I wanted to mention that strike me is that what we'll see happening is that the way that people build trust in sort of the currently within the crisis, but also post the crisis, I think will change. On the one hand, we see that sort of connectedness. On the other hand, we also see situations where there is a sense of distrust and a sense of distancing. And I think I don't have an idea how it's going to pan out, but my sense is that the way we build trust and we gain and lose trust is going to be different. And also what we clearly see now is also that the appreciation of risk has changed radically overnight in a matter of days. We see that in our LPs, we see that in sort of our co-investors in our portfolio companies. And I think that will be at least a few years before we would be back to a level where people are willing to take the same kind of risk that they have been taking so far over the last few years. The third thing that I've seen happening in crises and that I expect to see happening again now is similar to what Tokunboh was saying about sort of back to basics. I think is a renewed appreciation for what I would call authenticity. There's a lot of smoke and mirror sort of fantastic sort of shows happening where if you look behind the scenes, there's actually not much substance. I think the appreciation for substance and for authenticity actually will go up again. Those are the three things that come to mind for me to share now. And of course, also some perspectives on that I would happily share on sort of what I think that it means for different industries going forward. But I think we'll have that conversation a bit later.
Great, thanks so much, Wim. You know, part of just for everyone's sake, right? Part of the background to us sort of convening this was sort of really our observations over the last couple of years about, I think, some of the things you talked about, Wim, which is that it just felt like people were sort of, you know, playing roles on TV, and you know, you rarely found genuinely mission-driven folks, you know, in our ecosystem. And you also sort of found people who were sort of playing the short game versus the long game, you know. And of course, you know, what an event like this pandemic has done is that it's very similar to having the tide go out. You just learn very quickly who's wearing, you know, bathing suits and trunks and who's not. And the tide has gone out. But the tide comes back, right? And I think to the point you made, you know, and I think everybody who's sort of spoken clearly can share, is that we've seen, you know, we've seen the economies take hits. I don't think anyone on this panel that you sort of noticed, I think the attendees, that, you know, people have seen sort of multiple recessions and have gone through them, and, you know, they've been the darkest times, and they come back out. But I think it's super important to understand how to empower and enable yourselves with the tools. I mean, I liked Tokunboh's comment, which again is, you know, I talked about it at the beginning about sort of mental wellness and economic wellness, and then, you know, and sort of overall health wellness. None of those things takes precedence over the others, but it is important to make sure that we invest the right amounts of time and effort and energy into each of them. Now, what I thought would be useful to sort of get to would be sort of going back to Folabi, which is, okay, we are literally down the shaft. How do we build ladders to start the process of getting out of the shaft? Like what have you seen in the past that, you know, maybe there's certainly no actual, you know, sort of parallel, but some sort of very specific ideas and tools around what to do, you know, based on what sort of, you know, we're all sort of facing today. And that's sort of targeted at both sort of investors, whether they're angels or fund managers and the like, as well as entrepreneurs.
Thanks, Eghosa. And thanks to the other panelists for very insightful comments there. So the question is, how do we restart? How do we start trying to climb out of the hole that is still being dug at this point in time? And I have to emphasize that the hole is still being dug. I think this is what Rebecca emphasized, that we don't know how deep and how long this will go on for. So we're still in the middle of the whole storm, but we do have to start thinking what to do next. First, I can't emphasize enough the idea that you have to act fast. And you know, when I say act fast, you don't have all the information, so you're acting with incomplete information, which is what we do all the time as investors, entrepreneurs. But in this case, the first thing you have to do is stay healthy and stay alive. So that's, you know, that's a if you're not around, as Eghosa said, then you're not part of the equation. So please, everyone, make sure that you, as the leader, and all your people and everyone around you is taking the right steps. That's the first thing. The second thing is to stay positive, and that goes with keeping calm, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on, and it feels like the whole world's going to just keel over and, you know, end. Well, it won't. So what I think we need to do there is to keep informed. I'll point to a number of us who are on this webinar, on this meeting, are part of groups, different groups where we have events and we have ways to let this team out and also to get, information and to check with each other what's going on. So keep informed. The third thing I'll say is counter the infodemic, right? So there's a lot of information that is actually false. We shouldn't let ourselves get carried away with false information. We should maintain a stance of fact-checking, ensuring that what we say and what we do and what we propagate is as accurate as we can. Check it at all times, and we should make sure we inform everyone else around us. These things I've just mentioned help us actually as much as they help everyone else. And it speaks to the fourth thing I'm going to talk about here, which is the role of leadership across everybody and all spheres. Transnational, we can't do much about that unless there's a president sitting down somewhere in this meeting. National and organizational, we can start to do something about it. But certainly personal leadership is a very important thing. We are going to get through this, but we're not going to get through it alone. And the most important thing I'm going to talk about on this question, Eghosa, is, one of the biggest things we learned, and Tokunboh mentioned this because they found a different way to go to the market. We found a different way to actually operate in the market. And we ended up having, Raj, I can see what you're writing. Do I sound like a Dalek? No. So what we found was that we had to find a way to co-invest in all our deals. We targeted a certain large fund, so scaling down and reaching out. So you scale down what you think you're going to get and partner with other people. So I think a big part, the first thing I'd say to everyone else here is let's look inside and then see who is it that we can actually work with to collaborate and climb out of this hole together. It's not going to be done alone. And this is the most important thing I'll say. Let's look around you, see where you can partner with someone, where you can collaborate with someone, where you can work together with someone and start, harnessing and contributing resources so that you're not trying to do it alone. Nobody can do this alone. So that's the most important thing I'm going to say about this, Eghosa, and I'll let someone else go.
Great. That's helpful. I think you're absolutely right. I think I tried to touch upon that in part of the sort of the intro around pride. Was that the pride goes before the fall, but after the fall it hurts even more. And a lot of this is about we, like I said over and over again, we can't expect anybody to come and save us because they're trying to save themselves, and so we have to sort of do the hard things. You've got to put the ego aside and sort of figure out, are you mission driven? Is this something that's going to be important for the customers, and who do you need to work with to get that going? There's no pride. If you shut down your business, it's okay. You'll start another one. But it is about sort of taking, those lessons and making the hard decisions. That is also a key part of sort of resiliency. One of the things I think, Rebecca talked about was just sort of about this dark days. And I think what might be important to hear is sort of, okay, what else can a founder do, or chief executive? What are the specific things you did as the founder and chief executive to help navigate the company through that? Both sort of mechanically in terms of like operational, steps, but also how you also enabled yourself, how you empowered yourself to be able to get through that as well. It'd be great to hear from you.
Maybe I'll go. Starting with how do you empower yourself? I mean, I think it's very easy when you're in this kind of environment and situation to feel that you have to spend 24/7 thinking about the solutions, and not taking the time to be self-aware and therefore step away sometimes to be able to ignite your creativity. What I do is that, coming back to well-being, my my walks, my runs, my cycling, my fitness, whatever tickles your fancy, that gets you to, you know, lose something that you can lose yourself to contemplate hand. So whatever your poison is, you know, get out there and work out. Exert some physical energy to reignite yourself. That's one. Because obviously, it just as when you're on an airplane, as they say, put on your mask first before you put on somebody else's in the event of an emergency. You really need to, and this has already been stressed, you really need to look after yourself so that you can look after your team and your business and, you know, see clearly for a way forward. And I think it's important to be self-aware about where your strengths lie and where you're able to have influence. I think Folabi touched upon that. There's no point focusing on areas that are outside of your control at this point, because everything is just, you know, crazy. But the things that you can control within your sphere of influence, do that. And in addition to partnering, which I think is the way that many people will be able to find their way out of this, because as Eghosa said, you can't do this alone. Also, lend a helping hand, even if it's not partnering for your benefit, even if it's to help the other firm lift itself up, because your help can come from somewhere else, but someone else may be able to give you that help. So, and also you find that, what is it that we say, that the person that gives is more blessed than the one that's receiving, actually, because that also, and just being able to problem, because new models will evolve out of this, and in that sense will come innovation, just like I've said earlier. But on practical terms inside your firm, obviously you need to look at the cash, look at those things. The needs now are more important than the wants and the nice to haves. But you know, you just need to refocus. I come back to that again, and find innovative ways to lengthen your runway and to stay alive. But stay alive physically is very important, and so that you can have a better chance of staying alive economically.
Yeah, that's excellent, Tokunboh. Thanks a lot. That, you know, that actually sort of brings up this other construct around how you think as a founder or as a chief executive, how to stay alive, you know, from a corporate standpoint. You know, and that goes back to the whole concept of stress testing. And you're saying, listen, if I lose 30% of my revenues, you know, then what is the equivalent percentage of operating expenses that I have to lose? And if I lose 50% or 70%, and there are different ideas to do that. You can sort of move people, you know, to 50% salaries and whatever it is. But, you know, I think the key thing though is making those hard decisions early will benefit you in the long term. And if you have to sort of go down to a skeletal crew because your revenues have hit that 50% decline, then you do it. You know, there is no shame. We're not in the shame game now anymore. Like, everybody is struggling. You know, forget what they say on Twitter, forget what, I mean, even look at the guys on Instagram who are always sort of, you know, who are supposedly balling. Now they're, you know, they're trying to sort of ball at home. It doesn't work the same way, you know. So there is no shame. But you've got to do those hard things as well. And to talk about hard things, Rebecca, you started this thing off, you know, in 1999. Your timing was for one of a better word, exquisite, because then you just walked right into the NASDAQ crash. What were the things you did, you know, from a company perspective? How did you keep the lights on? What did you do about payroll? What did you do about strategy? How did you talk to customers? How did you make them pay you up front? Things like that. Will be great to sort of hear from you on that.
So one of the things that we did early was to sign long-term contracts. So a subscription model for services very early. So rather than, you know, so in our industry, AppsTech does a lot of customer support for companies that have Oracle installed. And traditionally, people were doing it on a per person that you're putting on, assigning to them. That's how they were charging. A lot of the Indian companies that were our competitors were doing it that way. And so you would assign 5 people to one company, one client. And so we actually took it a different way. And our model was we would sign an SLA. And so we would guarantee that your systems would be working if we were managing them. And so we signed long-term contracts with a fixed amount, which allowed us to use the resources that we wanted to. We didn't have to go back and forth with resumes, and especially with resumes, and you have people, you know, African names, because even though we started in the US, we had a lot of Africans. People that were reluctant to want to pay top dollar for these really, really competent Africans. And so we kind of hid behind our brand, spent a lot of money and a lot of energy on branding, kind of like the copied from McKinsey is like, you know, so whether the customer could see, can they afford us, not are we good enough? And so we really focused on a lot of branding activities, not necessarily expensive ones, so that we would be the go-to, and then try to sign really long-term contracts, 3-year, 4-year contracts with large companies. Even in those circumstances, we had some of those companies that couldn't pay anymore, that had to reduce significantly. I mean, so we still had challenges, but because we had long-term contracts and subscriptions, people, you know, we survived. That's how we survived. A lot of our competitors, I would say 80% of our competitors disappeared during that period. Like size companies, even some much larger companies disappeared. So I think that's part of it. Also, we didn't have any angel investment or any investment of any type. And so it was really, we were all cash flow based because I couldn't raise money. This is 1999, 2000. I just couldn't raise money. And so we had to do it on our own, which also meant that we could make a lot of the decisions on our own. And perhaps had we had investors, they may not have kept us alive as long as we were able to stay alive. Because, I mean, we had nothing else to lose. I mean, you shut down, you're through. Whereas, you know, we all took salary cuts. We all took, well, I didn't have a salary back then, but so it was really just being able to make those decisions on our own. And I know there are a lot of investors on this call. You've got to trust your entrepreneurs. You've got to trust those that you invested in to make the right decisions. I think sometimes you may not get a sense or feel for some of the people. Like one of the highest paid people in the company was my assistant, right? And it's not because she was, that assistant should make that much. It's because that her skills and her abilities saved me so much headache and pain and stress that it was well worth it. And if you're looking at just a salary thing and you're saying, okay, this person, why are you paying this person? This person is getting paid too much. I think from that perspective, please do trust your entrepreneurs. Help them get through this as a family, as a community. Be very human. I think some of our, you know, the reasons I've been in business 21 years is that I'm very human. I put my human side first. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear it. You want to be very cut and dry, and but I'm not that way. And I think that helped us survive, not just the early crash, but the subsequent challenges that we've had as a company.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. I certainly found that helpful because, I'm also a small business owner, even though sort of the outside world will call me a general partner, but, we're running businesses. These are operational businesses, as a fund manager, and sort of, having that empathy, leading off with that empathy, I think is very important. And when you pair that with sort of honest and transparent communications, your chances of surviving any kind of downturn, I think, increase dramatically. I wanted to sort of latch on to something you said, Rebecca. By the way, we're going to welcome both Clive and Stephan very, very soon. They just joined us. Welcome. We'll circle to you both shortly. But I wanted to sort of latch on to something you talked about in terms of sort of, increasing sort of your branding and sort of being very guerrilla in the way you sort of, built that out at sort of a low cost, because you're doing exactly what the example I gave about being counterintuitive with the boat example, where, literally you turn into the direction of the wind, you sort of hit it at a certain angle. And it's very counterintuitive because people are sort of thinking, oh, we need to cut that completely, take it all out. But fundamentally, you just have to rethink it. But, it comes down to the market really truly trusting you, right? And, and I loved what Wim said, which I want to sort of have us go back to, which was, risk and authenticity, right? And Wim, it'll be great to have you sort of, lean in on those two themes and talk about sort of how, how we should reconfigure ourselves to sort of both understand, appreciate, and underwrite risk, but also sort of really reward true authenticity, because it is literally the survival tool for the post-COVID world.
Okay, maybe to start with the last one, the authenticity. What I found is also always a useful exercise to do when you are about to invest in a business is to picture yourself on the ledge of a building with your eyes closed and sitting next to that founder that you're about to invest into. And is that somebody you would want to sit next to when you sit on the edge of an abyss or on the ledge of a building, and that to listen to your own sort of your own body language. If you sort of instinctively move back a bit, then you know that there is not 100% trust and there's not 100% sort of sense of authenticity. And I think that is something that is a skill that we that when markets are going up and when everything is gung-ho, the sense that you actually need to get through difficult times together might not always be there. In difficult times, sort of the packaging falls away a bit, and you see people for who they truly are. And that's true in terms of personal crisis as much as it is true in times of crisis that we're experiencing right now. And I think that is something that will also determine also how we deal both as investment firms, where we deal with essentially dealing with the sense of insecurity, both from our portfolios but also from our investors. And that's something that I think we'll also find out going forward, is which of the investors that we have in our funds, if in the case that we are managing funds that are based on raising capital from investors, that are actually honestly interested in what we do, or just saw us as a nice addition to a cool range of investments. So the authenticity will also be tested, not just for the portfolio companies, but also for the investors in our circles. And I think we will also find that out from all of the investors around the table who have been raising money for Africa over the last sort of years, to what extent will they be able to continue to put their money into the opportunities going forward? I think that is going to be tested as well. So in that sense, I think the sort of the post-crisis world that we would be looking at, there will be definitely quite a significant reshuffling, and we'll see, which also creates new opportunity, but definitely also will mean that we'll be disappointed here and there.
Yeah, that's some excellent feedback, because I think, you know, anti-fragility extends to both entrepreneurs as well as investors. And the truth of the matter is that, you know, I was going to talk about it towards the end, but this is probably as good a time to sort of bring in Stephan into it, because he's been sort of an investor of investors for forever. But, you know, one of the key things I wanted to sort of share with the audience is what we are hearing on the streets about you know, what I'll call the Twitter investors, those who sort of write nice little tweets about, you know, being open for business, but then they're really not, because there's a lot of stuff that's going on behind the scenes that is really brutal. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to see very significant layoffs from US startups. You know, I mean, there was one that conducted a 300-person layoff by Zoom 2 days ago. And we're going to see a lot more. And, you know, a lot of the investors that are talking about it, because a lot of people, I think, in this ecosystem don't understand how everything is connected. So we know that limited partners in a lot of those funds that we're encouraging funds to deploy in 1 year, 2 years, you know, because they've gotten hammered in other assets, particularly in public equities, so telling folks, don't make a capital call because it's not going to get sent. Investors are now going back to funds, to companies, and saying, hey, listen, that valuation we agreed on, you know, a month ago is going to come down by 50%, 60%, 70%, or there's no money. And these are shock waves that will continue to ripple. And this is an emerging market, so you can only imagine what will happen in an emerging market like ours, because we will just, of course, get, you know, the hardest shock wave, because that's going to be at the tail end of the distribution. So we have Stephan, who joined us, you know, and, you know, Stephan has been around for a long time. He's one of the biggest supporters of sort of emerging market, you know, funds, and very deep insights into the market. And we would love to hear, Stephan, from some of your end as sort of the investor of investors, how, you know, how you think the sentiment is going to sort of evolve as Africa, whether or not Africa remains an opportunity, particularly when the US starts to become, you know, starts to sell at a 50% discount. Does Africa even remain interesting at all for anybody?
Yeah, thanks. So sentiment was already changing before Christmas, and what we saw was a lot of pension funds in the UK, at least, seems to be the same, or corporate pension funds in the UK, the US and Europe, were cutting back on private markets allocations. Let's not pretend that other things didn't happen. We had a barrage over the last couple of years, and incorrectly as it happens, but doesn't matter, that has been attributed to Africa, or has been associated with Africa. And so people are saying, I don't want to invest in any place that allows this to happen. Well, it happened in the Caymans and in Dubai, but people are going to carry on investing there. But it is what it is. So you've got to work hard. Now, the simple reality is people's sentiment changes in a crisis. And it's not that they're being disingenuous. It's not necessarily that they are being vultures and taking advantage of things. If you look at post 9/11, a lot of people moved out of New York forever and decided they didn't want to be there anymore. This will be the same. People will decide that they don't want to be in a big city, and people will change their mind about how they want to live their lives. They'll also take that forward into how they are investing. But also, with people changing their lifestyles and not being in the office, they can't make decisions. Some group are not set up to make decisions. They're not legally allowed to make decisions on a conference call. They've got to be there in person. So that needs to change, and it'll take time. So you're going to see a delay in decisions. The way to work this out is to focus on the positives, and you got to talk about how no battle plan survives the first engagement with the enemy. You always have to change things. That's the life of the startup. 80% of startups change their business plan within the first 12 months. That's how it goes. This is just another one of those. In terms of the positives, Microsoft was set up in a recession. So were Apple and Facebook. And if you go back far enough, so was GE. This is the opportunity. This is the time that really tests companies, really tests fund managers. You have to identify all possible sources of income, and you have to be flexible on the sources of income. And you might have a beautiful business plan and a beautiful concept, but you have to fish a little bit wider at the moment, and you have to start taking on consulting roles in order to keep the income coming in order to keep the doors open. And you mentioned, you know, do you sack 50% of your staff, or do you cut everyone's staff by half, or do you do something in between? Well, we're all going to face that. We're all going to be doing that. And you've got to make those decisions. And some people will make those decisions for you, because actually in this environment, they don't want to be working for a startup. And that's not because they weren't committed in the first place. Life's changed. It has absolutely changed right now. And so some of them will be looking for jobs elsewhere. Maybe not right now, but when things pick up again. And while the COVID, let's say the lockdown for COVID goes on till the end of the year, which is certainly reasonable, your funding problems aren't going to end then. They're going to carry on for a couple of years after that. It's going to take a long time for people to get back. So you've got to be leaner, you've got to be more flexible, and you've got to work out how you're going to get that. And listening to Rebecca earlier, how she was saying that they had clients and the clients didn't have the money, and you have to accept lower fees from them and lower income on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis. You're also going to look to who are the ultimate funders of your businesses. Well, it's generally pension funds and endowments. Pension funds, as I said, were already cutting back, and some of them are going to see this as an opportunity, so we'll step back in and step up. But endowments, contrary to the view on Sand Hill Road, they do change their mind. And in a recession, if you look at the 2008 recession, Harvard saw all their lower income applicants stop. They just stopped applying to Harvard because they just thought there's no way we can afford it. So the university went to the endowment and said, you need to dip your hand in your pocket and put out more bursaries, more scholarships. We have to have 30% lower income, and that's the only way to get them. So we're going to get them, and you're going to pay for it. Well, Harvard had to spend money elsewhere, and spending their money on startups and with their GPs wasn't what they wanted. So they spoke to their GPs and said, don't make any more calls. We won't give you the money. So the GPs didn't make any calls. They didn't make any investments in companies. And when they got to successive rounds for companies, they pulled back and said, no, you've got to tighten your belt and you've got to work this through longer. And some of them, they just walked away from. So the GPs are not going to have as much discretion as they claim they have, as much as they would like to have. So they're not going to be able to put money in. And pension funds might be coming back. But what does this mean? This means that the dynamics are going to change. Some of the pension funds that couldn't get into the top name GPs will be looking at other GPs, spin outs, and that's probably where you should be looking at who's raised funds recently and who's got the cash. So I think I've done a little bit of a plane of consciousness there, so I've covered a few areas, so I'm going to pause at that point.
That's great. Thanks so much. So we've got let me see. Yeah, we've got Clive joining us as well. We'd love to hear, Clive, a little bit of background on sort of where you've been, what you're doing, and sort of your view on how best to navigate it through this current period.
Yeah, thanks. Firstly, my apologies about ending late. just actually on a board call that took a lot longer because of we going through this discussion of looking at our best possible solution, our worst possible solution, and intermediary solutions. I'll talk more about that now. So just quickly, my background, always been an entrepreneur, computer science background. I joined Accenture, actually put a pin in my entrepreneurial dreams. I joined Accenture and I stayed at Accenture for 28 years, ran the company in South Africa, built it to a multi-billion rand business, a few and a half thousand people. But I had the privilege really of working around the world in India and Israel and Silicon Valley and Boston, New York, London, building tech businesses. So I'm very familiar, even though I was in a inverted commas corporate, I was a tech entrepreneur. I retired about 8 years ago and I started my own VC business and Kalon Venture Partners. We actually got private individuals, so personal tax individuals. In our fund, we've got 8 investments. We're looking at making our 9th investment. And it's really most interesting, and sorry, in very disruptive tech. So we only invest in companies that are South African domiciled, but that we can take into Africa and we can take to the globe and exit preferably around the globe. My board and I have all built and sold quite a few businesses in South Africa and around the globe as well. So what are we finding? It's quite interesting. So we in lockdown from tomorrow morning in South Africa. I'm sure Verma, I know you in South Africa, and a couple of you, I think it's and Johannes in South Africa. So we're in lockdown formally from tomorrow. What are we seeing here? We're seeing definitely, I've experienced, not myself, but I've experienced where there's been a commitment to invest, and the investors have pulled out at the last second in the last week and said, no, I'm not investing, or wanted to renegotiate the terms, one of our co-investors with an entrepreneur. We don't do that, and that's basically destroyed the deal, which is very, very unfortunate. But you know, you have to respect the investor. Times have changed, and we're living in a new world. And so we have to future-proof our business. They want to do future-proof their businesses. So of our 8 investments we've got, it's quite interesting. 4 of them are counter-cyclical. One is a payments business. One is a digital marketing business. One is there's a few other businesses, but 4 of them are really, we've had to sort of get extra people on the phone because there's been so much demand for our services through these tough times. And most of them are e-commerce based, where the bricks and mortar ones are, are having problems. We're finding the non-bricks and mortar, more the internet digital based businesses are just absolutely flying. So we're looking at the reverse of getting rid of people. We're not hiring yet. We're going to wait for the 3-week, lockdown in South Africa, and then we're going to make a decision on hiring additional people. Some of our businesses are growing at 200-300% month on month, and then there's a couple of them, or 2 of them actually, one in the hospitality industry, one in the manufacturing industry, who, I mean, in all honesty, they've lost every customer. Customers are just sitting on their wallets, not prepared to spend a cent, and saying we're waiting another month to see, how South Africa plays out, how the economy plays out, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, with these businesses, one of them we're fine with because we've just raised a 24-month round of capital. So we've got time to actually, shave off or prune the tree as much as we can, cut costs as much as we can, and let that 24 months become a 36-month runway. So we're actually quite confident in that one. The other one, we were just in the process of raising. We were about to raise, and the raising was cut off at the last second. So we're in a bit of trouble there with only 3 to 4 months of runway left. And it's a potential business that might have to close. Unfortunately, 20, 30 people in the business. It's doing about $1 million, but a nice growth business, a really good growth business. But there's just been, there's been a complete turnaround in terms of interest in investing money to still having the interest, but let's wait and see what's going on. So positive and negative, but most importantly, what we've done, and myself as the CEO of Kalon, is really go to each of our businesses and looked at the best, the worst, and the middle situation. And the most important thing right now for the listeners is you got to cut back. If it's, I think Stephan was saying, you got to cut back from 5-day weeks to 3-day weeks to 10-20% cut in salaries. But you got to get that runway as far as you possibly can, because every month that you can get an additional month, you've got a chance of turning the business around. When we get out of this economic recession, when the capital markets get some life again, you've got a chance of actually raising capital and keeping your business alive. So you really have to be absolutely vigilant on how you cut costs. and think of every single cent that you actually spend. The last thing you do is start hiring now. You know, you don't hire before the curve, you hire after the curve. So if you do get that growth through these uncertain times, no problem in hiring people as long as you've got a long enough runway. And typically, I would say from South Africa, it took 6 to 9 months, maybe 6 to 12 months to raise a good round of Series A round of capital. It's definitely, that's, I'd say, 12 to 24 months to raise a Series A. So your runway is going from 12 months where you're quite safe in a nice high growth company to probably 12 to 24 months in a high growth company, but that's how long it's going to take to raise the capital. So that's the sort of where we're seeing it. We're in the middle of it. It's not all gloom and doom. I mean, there are, in every case of adversity, as Stephen said, I mean, some great companies are built, and we're seeing some phenomenal, some of our investing companies and other companies in South Africa that are riding the cyclical wave, that are anti-coronavirus, and we're seeing some real unbelievable growth coming out of these companies. But so you got to take the good with the bad. You know, unfortunately, none of us could foresee what was coming. I mean, some VCs might say they could see it, but I think they've been smoking something that's quite strong. But we typically don't see. You couldn't have seen this stuff, and sometimes we have good investments through absolute luck, and others bad investments through absolute bad luck. But all in all, we are where we are. You can't change where we are. We are, as Kalon, going on a $100 million a race for Africa. We've obviously realized that right now is not the right time for that. We're going to wait a couple of months before we go on our roadshows. So that big fund to go to the family offices, go to the institutional investors, we're going to wait a few months before we go on that roadshow. And that's predominantly going to be European and American capital that we think we can get access for, because we've got a track record here in South Africa. We've got access to most parts of Africa, and we still see an interest in putting these funds into Africa. But as someone said earlier, there's been a significant, slowdown or let's wait and see type of attitude. So we actually excited. I'm really excited about where we are in this business. I think the fundamental, if we look at the fundamental economics, I'm not talking about South Africa now, but if we look at the fundamental economics of the world, they're not different. A good company is a good company. If you look at the tech companies, they're great tech companies. I'm not talking about the WeWorks and the Ubers and some of these ones that are not making profit and have revaluations. Fundamentally, there's good companies out there, and I think as long as you look at the fundamentals of the company and not the timing, it's just we're in a bad neighborhood, a bad seasonal type of thing that's going on. You just need to, as an entrepreneur, for those of you out there, you just got to survive this downturn. It's going to get better. We don't know how long it's going to take. 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, we don't know. But there will be spring again. There will be summer again, and it's going to turn around. So I'm a positive guy. I see the positive side of this negativity. But it has made us think about every single thing we do in our business. It has made us think about how we always future-proof what our businesses are going to look like in the future. So yeah, as I say, I'm seeing more positive than negative, but there is a lot of negativity, and we have to, as I say, we have to do things fundamentally differently to the way we did them in the past.
That's fantastic, Clive. Thank you so much. That I think sort of nicely wraps up, everything so we talked about, and we'll take one or two questions before we wrap up because we have about 13 minutes left. But I think, to summarize the key takeaways there, again, hard decisions, you got to sort of, hard decisions, you got to figure out how, you can get your company to lengthen its runway, whatever the metaphor you're using, whether it's a ventilator or whatever it is, but you've got to figure that part out. And if you have to lighten the load to be able to fly a little further, which is exactly how it works in nature, then you do that. Right? That's going to be very important. Now, one of the questions that came in, which I thought was an interesting one, was to figure what someone asked how companies that are thriving at this time can navigate and maintain momentum. And it's a great question because, again, I think to Clive's point, we've been fortunate in the sense that we've got a very barbell look in the portfolio. We've got some companies that just literally came to a screeching halt. We've got some that are, have never seen growth as insane as they're seeing right now. And so for those who are who still have momentum, what do you need to do? Well, Part of it is making sure, I think, as Rebecca said, about making sure of the value that you bring, because if you had value at a time when the economy was great, chances are good that you're probably going to maintain that value for a certain segment of your customers, or maybe even increase the value that you bring to them. So you don't necessarily have to sort of think about sort of discounting that. And if you do, then you sort of lengthen the contract term so you get some certainty over timeline, but maybe you take a little bit less. The other thing that you also have to think about, when we talk about sort of accounts payables and accounts receivables, so, in a recessionary sort of environment, everybody becomes the receivables manager, everybody, right? And so you have to sort of accept that you are going to be a receivables manager. And the key thing is to make sure that those receivables don't lengthen, right? And so when it comes down to sort of risk allocation, again, this is about having transparent and honest conversations with your customers. Listen, you can't be taking on the risk. There has to be shared risk. If it's a big customer, they just have to sort of prepay for it because, they will have access to credit lines and the like that you as a startup would never have access to. And so you've got to sort of think about risk in a very clear and cogent way to support the businesses. The other thing I think that, shows up here that we've talked a little bit about is authenticity. And that also sort of means, and authenticity, when you pair that with empathy, is a very important thing, because you also have to understand as a founder, for instance, or as a general partner, as a fund manager, is that, one level up the stack, right, is sort of dealing with its own thing, right? So the founders who are like, oh, our investors are not supporting us, right, because they're not giving us money, the investor is sitting and going, listen, I have a limited partner who's like, don't call me because you're going to get a no. So let me just tell you, here's your no in advance, and you can sort of figure it out. So, they might not necessarily pass that information on to you, but investors also take hits. I mean, we as a fund, we took one, the federal government of Nigeria committed 10 million and then just never give it to us. And, and then, folks are trying to figure out whether or not we should pay them under the table. We're like, no, we're not going to do that. But we took that hit. It was a gut punch, and we stuck it out. And eventually, we were able to sort of come out of it. But, if that was probably a recession. So I've gone through maybe 3 or 4 or 5 recessions now if I had that. But it is important that you're able to sort of, understand that you might have to take 2 steps backwards to go forward, but you're going to have to do that. One important thing as well is figuring out how to have mental support. Tokunboh's point about sort of finding your release valve is going to be very important. It is just designed to allow you to clear your head. I can't tell you enough how that is so important, because, and to everybody who deals with it, yes, you're right. Eventually, sometimes you think shit is going to hit the fan, you curl in the corner, you give yourself a good cry, and then you come out and you say, okay, tomorrow's a new day. What do I need to do? But it is going to be very, very important. To those who have a sort of a roster of, cross-border investors or American investors, let me tell you something that's coming, because nobody may actually tell you this thing because, it just doesn't show up. But a lot of the younger companies, because they, got pretty dependent on American investors, have all sort of incorporated in the US. The US has just passed a $2 trillion package. There is a real possibility that a Democrat is going to come into power in November. They're going to want to get their money back. Trust me. And for them to get their money back, they're going to have to tax it. And they might tax individuals, which, politically doesn't sort of give you more than one term, but they might actually try to tax corporations and small businesses, which means therefore that, your exposure to the US tax regime, in a post, stimulation package environment is going to make things a little bit more difficult for you. So, most people don't mention that, but it is something to keep in mind, and I know, yes, it was great. You can sort of incorporate a company in Delaware over the internet and life's good, but you're going to get hit with a double whammy. One, you're going to probably run into US investors who are like, hey, listen, for your risk, I got to focus on what's local. So, hey, give me a call in a year. And then you're going to get hit by this whole thing about, US government says, hey, you know what? We're taxing everybody. And, we see you're making all this money in Nigeria. but you know what, you're a US company and we have extraterritorial jurisdiction, so we're gonna go, you know, you gotta pay taxes on it. And, you know, you're paying taxes in dollars on revenues in Naira. You know, that's just a terrible combination. So that's something that I think you need to keep in mind. And then, you know, going back to the whole thing about collaborating, I think that message is true both for investors as well as founders, right? I do understand that, you know, in every new sort of ecosystem, everybody's trying to create their own sort of, you know, their own reputation. They want to sit down and say, hey, listen, my deal flow is proprietary, my this, my that. But guess what? We all suffer as an ecosystem if half our companies die because we all decided that we're just going to invest on our own. That's, you know, we need to sort of have a very brutal, very sort of Darwinian view of sort of the companies that will last. But we also need to come together as an investor class to make sure that, yes, fine, you might have co-investments in some companies. It won't be true for everything in your portfolio, but it is unusual, I think, in any ecosystem to not have crossover. And we're seeing that a lot in the market. We never quite understood it. But for the greater good, again, to build resiliency, to build intracontinental anti-fragility, you know, we will have to sort of work together as investors, in addition to working together as founders. And, you know, there are lots of people who are sort of available to guide you. Again, no shame, don't stress about it. It's just, it is what it is. Everybody's going through, you know, everybody is going through hell. And as, you know, the classic sort of thing from US Special Forces, if you find yourself in hell, you keep going. So that's going to be, I think, a key message for that. Another question that came up was that whether or not we think it's the moment to redefine fundraising for GPs and for general partners or fund managers and for limited partners to try to reinvent themselves. I think to Stephen's point, you know, people sort of, you know, recede, you know, and, you know, it is an interesting view. I mean, having been through, you know, 3 recessions or 4, I don't even know how many now, you know, one of the interesting things that sort of I point out to people was that the best opportunity to show up. You know, I had that personal view. You know, we had, you know, I brought in Facebook in 2007 to do it at a 10 billion valuation and brought them in at the beginning of 2009 to do it at a $4.77 billion valuation when it was 6 times bigger, right? But that was just the market, right? But the market needed people who could invest with conviction. The same way the market needed entrepreneurs and founders who could create and deliver with conviction. So the market is always going to need those people, but those people would need supporters, right? And I think, you know, limited partners, you know, at the end of the day, you know, I worked at Intel, you know, one of the things we learned very quickly was you just keep the foot down, right? Because what then happens is that when the recession goes, which it does, you come out with more momentum than everybody else does. And, you know, at this point in time, you know, great companies are getting founded, great companies are getting are going into pivot mode, but will become better. That's going to be, I think, important to continue the support of the funds in the market. And I think finally, one question that came up was how do you get out of people that are either afraid, your employees, your ecosystem, either afraid, they have apathy. You know, this is why these markets bring out the absolute best in leaders. You've got to figure out a way to keep people re-energized. You got to figure out a way to keep people focused. You know, and that's going to be key. But I will say that, you know, there are different ideas around that. But what's important is that you find as a founder that all that energy you devote into making sure your people are re-energized comes out of you. And so you have to figure out where your fuel station is, right? And you got to go there periodically. And you need to make sure you can top up, because otherwise you find yourself running on empty, and that signal and that energy and that lack of energy, and that just sort of, you know, spreads, and you've got to be very careful of that. So I think, you know, to wrap this up, you know, hopefully we get a strong sense from folks that, listen, we're all together in this thing. I have never been, and, you know, I speak for myself as well as the EchoVC team, we've never been more excited to sort of support our founders and the like. We are the only ones that can get ourselves out of this jam. We need to sort of work together. We need to be much more honest and transparent. You know, we're all human. We will have our own failings. But fundamentally, you know, and sort of highlight Vim's point about authenticity, people will need to know who you are when no one's looking. And the truth is, now is no better time to reconfigure yourself, figure out how to support the folks around you authentically, and then, you know, just figure out how to sort of be the best investor of intellectual capacity, of time, of resources, of energy, and of empathy that you can. So, you know, big thanks to the entire panel. Thanks to all the attendees. You know, we're incredibly grateful to have all of you attend. You know, if there are any inputs, you know, we're certainly happy to have this again if necessary. You know, bring a slightly different roster of panelists. But we're very grateful to all the attendees. Thanks for attending, and keep your head up, stay safe, keep well, and you know, and only do things that scale.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.